3 minutes can feel like nothing when you are waiting for coffee to brew. But 3 minutes inside a Senate hearing room can feel like watching a bridge crack under the weight of a freight train, because you know something is about to give and you know the sound it makes will not be subtle. So let me ask you something before we go any further. If the person in charge of protecting the law uses that authority to make evidence harder to see, is that oversight or is that obstruction with better lighting? This was not a routine oversight hearing about paperwork and filing cabinets and bureaucratic dust. This was a stress test of whether power protects itself when the spotlight turns white hot. And for 17 seconds, the spotlight did not blink. 3 minutes earlier, inside the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on the Constitution, what unfolded did not look dramatic at first glance, because the most consequential moments rarely announce themselves with raised voices or pounding fists. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse did not grandstand. He did not posture. He did not perform for the cameras the way Washington veterans sometimes do when C-SPAN is rolling and they know a clip might circulate before lunch. He simply placed a document face down on the table, looked directly at FBI Director Kash Patel, and began to read 4 lines out loud. 4 lines. And that was enough to stop one of the most disciplined communicators in modern Washington cold. Kash Patel is not a novice, not someone who stumbles under pressure or forgets his talking points when a senator leans forward. He has stared down federal prosecutors, navigated impeachment theater, survived hostile congressional crossfire that would leave most officials sweating through their jackets before the first recess. He knows how to turn 40 minutes of questioning into procedural fog, how to answer without answering, how to sound transparent without conceding a single inch. He walked into that hearing room at 9:47 a.m. with 2 attorneys flanking him and a thick leather portfolio under his arm, carrying himself like a man who has done this before and expects to do it again. For the first 45 minutes, that confidence looked justified. The agenda said oversight review of FBI document classification and retention protocols, which is Washington's way of saying this will be boring enough that most of you will not watch. Classification timelines, retention schedules, field office reporting structures. Patel handled it smoothly, his answers detailed enough to sound substantive, vague enough to commit him to nothing that could be weaponized later. Safe ground. He was running the clock, and he was doing it elegantly, until Sheldon Whitehouse took the microphone and the air in the room changed. There is a specific silence that settles over a room when everyone senses that the real hearing is about to begin, and it is not something you see on a transcript. It is something you feel in your spine. Whitehouse did not signal it with a flourish. He did not clear his throat theatrically. He did not announce that he was pivoting to something explosive. He reached into his folder, removed a single document, and placed it face down on the table with the kind of quiet precision that tells you this was planned, not improvised. Then he looked at Kash Patel and said, "Director Patel, I want to talk about one specific document today." And in that moment, this stopped being a procedural review and became something else entirely. Whitehouse identified the document by reference number, EC 2019 PB 047. An internal FBI communication from the Palm Beach field office to headquarters, dated November 14, 2019. Subject line, Follow-up Classification Review. Epstein Matter. Individuals of Interest. Originally marked confidential, standard investigative material. Reclassified to top secret. Special access required on February 3rd of this year, 17 days after Kash Patel was confirmed as FBI Director. Let that timeline sit with you for a second. November 14, 2019, Field Office Communication. February 3rd this year, upgraded to the highest level of classification available, special access required, which is not something that happens because a clerk misclicks a drop-down menu. That requires a deliberate human decision, a sign-off, an authorization chain. And according to Whitehouse's investigation, 11 months of subpoenas, 3 court challenges, 2 Inspector General requests, that reclassification was initiated not by a classification review board, not by the National Security Division, but by a direct request from the Director's office, Kash Patel's office. Whitehouse did not shout that fact. He delivered it the way a prosecutor lays out a sequence of dates on a timeline in front of a jury and then steps back. "Director Patel," he asked, "in your first 17 days running the FBI, why did you make it a priority to reclassify a document naming individuals connected to Jeffrey Epstein?" And here is where we need to slow down, because this is the hinge. When you move a document from confidential to top secret, special access required, you are not adjusting formatting, you are restricting who can see it, who can reference it, who can move it toward public release. You are burying it deeper. Kash Patel's initial response was controlled, measured, textbook Washington. Reclassification decisions are made based on ongoing law enforcement sensitivities and national security considerations that I am not able to discuss in open session. That answer sounds responsible on the surface, like someone safeguarding investigations and protecting intelligence equities. But Whitehouse was not finished, and he did not let the fog linger. He placed a second document on the table, this one public, this one entered into federal court record in the Southern District of Florida in 2020. A sworn deposition from a former Epstein household employee. A woman who worked at the Palm Beach residence for 3 years. Whitehouse read from it directly. "I personally observed Mr. Epstein entertaining guests on at least 40 separate occasions. On a minimum of 12 of those occasions, the guests included young women who appeared to me to be under the age of 18. I observed these guests being introduced to Mr. Epstein's associates. Among the associates I recognized was..." He paused just long enough to let the weight gather. "Donald Trump." No explosion followed. No audible gasp rippled through the chamber, because the power of that moment was not in noise, it was in stillness. This testimony had been referenced before, hinted at in filings, circulated in fragments, but hearing it read aloud clearly, on the record, in a federal hearing room by a sitting United States senator, that is different. Kash Patel's face did not show shock. He does not shock easily. It showed compression, the subtle tightening of someone calculating in real time. Whitehouse then connected the dots explicitly. "This deposition," he said, "was in FBI custody as of 2020, part of the same investigative record that contained document EC 2019 PB047. The same record, the same file universe, the same material that was reclassified to the highest level 17 days into Kash Patel's tenure. Now the question sharpened. When you made the decision to reclassify that document, Whitehouse asked, were you aware that the investigative record contains sworn testimony naming Donald Trump as a witness to potentially criminal activity at Jeffrey Epstein's residence? That is not a procedural question. That is not about filing cabinets. That is a yes or no question with no safe landing. Because if Kash Patel answers yes, he knew, then the reclassification is not neutral bureaucracy. It is a deliberate act taken with knowledge that the record contained testimony implicating a former president. If he answers no, he either admits he authorized a major classification upgrade without knowing what was inside the document, which is reckless at best, or he denies knowledge and risks contradiction later if internal communications show otherwise. No good answer existed. And everyone in that room understood it simultaneously. That is when the silence fell heavy. 17 seconds. Not 1, not 5, not the polite pause before an answer. 17 seconds of Kash Patel sitting in that chair, lips parted slightly, left hand pressed flat against the table, fingers tense. One attorney shifted in his seat. The other went completely still, the way people do when they know any whisper might make things worse. 17 seconds is long enough for you to hear your own pulse in your ears. And here is the part that matters morally, not politically. The Epstein case is not an abstract scandal. It is a series of allegations involving real young women, real lives, real harm. When documents related to that case are reclassified to become harder to access, the impact is not theoretical. It affects whether the public ever sees the full record of who knew what and when. This is not about embarrassing powerful names. It is about whether transparency bends when influence is involved. And if it does, then what exactly is the classification system protecting? Kash Patel finally spoke, his voice quieter than it had been at any point earlier in the hearing. Director's office memoranda are part of an internal deliberative process, Senator. I am not in a position to discuss deliberative process communications in this setting. Notice what he did not say. He did not say yes. He did not say no. He invoked deliberative process. That is a legal shield, not an answer. It protects internal communications from disclosure under certain circumstances, but it does not resolve the moral question posed in that room. Were you aware? Did you know? Whitehouse gathered his papers calmly, almost clinically. He summarized what had been established. An FBI document containing testimony that included Donald Trump's name was reclassified to top secret. Special access required 17 days after Kash Patel took office. An action memorandum from the director's office recommending expedited review of Epstein documents referencing senior government officials was issued 2 days before that reclassification. And when asked directly whether he was aware of the document's contents before authorizing its upgrade, the director declined to answer. This was not theater. This was chronology. And chronology does not care about party affiliation. So ask yourself as you picture that room and those 17 seconds stretching thin across the floor like a wire pulled too tight. If the law applies equally, why does the system move faster to restrict access than to clarify truth? If classification decisions are purely about national security, why prioritize a document connected to Jeffrey Epstein within 17 days of taking office? And if the answer is hidden behind process language, who exactly benefits from that silence? This was not a normal hearing. It was a moment when the machinery of government was caught mid-motion, and for 17 seconds it stalled under the weight of its own implications. And this is only the beginning. If you think this was just an awkward exchange between a senator and a witness, you are missing the architecture of what unfolded, because what Sheldon Whitehouse did next was not emotional. It was structural, and structure is where power either collapses or holds. This is where we shift into prosecutorial mode, not because drama demands it, but because logic does. Dates matter. Memos matter. Routing numbers matter. Whitehouse did not rely on innuendo or insinuation. He relied on a paper trail that does not care about ideology. February 1st of this year, 2 days before the reclassification of EC 2019 PB047, an internal FBI Director's Office action memorandum was issued. That memorandum recommended that all documents containing references to current or former senior government officials in the Epstein investigative record be reviewed for upgraded classification. It further stated that the review should be completed on an expedited basis. Priority should be given to documents containing references to the current administration's principal officers and their pre-office associations. That language is not vague. It is precise. It does not say review documents for accuracy. It does not say cross-check witness statements. It says review for upgraded classification and do it quickly. Now layer that against the timeline. November 14th, 2019. The Palm Beach field office generates internal correspondence listing individuals identified by investigators as having documented contact with Jeffrey Epstein at his residence between 1999 and 2005. 2020. A sworn deposition from a former Epstein household employee entered into federal court record names Donald Trump among associates present during occasions when underage girls appeared to be introduced. February 1st this year. Director's Office memorandum recommending expedited reclassification review for documents referencing senior government officials. February 3rd. EC 2019 PB047 is reclassified to top secret. Special access required. This is not conspiracy theory. This is calendar arithmetic. And when you stack those dates together, the sequence is not random. It is directional. In any courtroom in America, when you present a jury with a timeline that tight, you do not need to yell. You simply ask them whether coincidence is a stronger explanation than intent. Whitehouse did not use the word intent, But he did not need to, because the inference was sitting there in plain sight. The reclassification did not occur years into Patel's tenure, after months of review and internal restructuring. It occurred 17 days in, 17 days. That is barely enough time to memorize the parking garage layout beneath the Hoover Building, let alone conduct a sweeping audit of classification protocols. Yet one of the earliest substantive actions tied to Epstein-related records was to make at least one document dramatically harder to access. If you are director of the FBI and you inherit a case that has already shaken public trust, what is your first instinct supposed to be? To pull back the curtain or to reinforce it? Whitehouse pressed further, not theatrically, but methodically. He referenced the authorization chain. When a document moves from confidential to top secret, special access required, it requires sign-off from an official with appropriate authority. It is logged. It is routed. It leaves fingerprints in the system. Whitehouse stated that his team traced the authorization chain and found that the reclassification was initiated by a direct request from the director's office. Not the Classification Review Board, not the National Security Division, the director's office. That distinction matters because it narrows responsibility. It eliminates the possibility that some mid-level analyst unilaterally made a judgment call. It ties the action to the top of the building. And when you are at the top, you do not get to hide behind institutional blur. Kash Patel attempted to reframe the issue in procedural terms, invoking law enforcement sensitivities and national security considerations. That language is powerful because it appeals to caution, to prudence, to the idea that certain information must remain shielded to protect investigations or intelligence sources. But Whitehouse had already undercut that defense by placing the February 1st memorandum into the record. The memorandum did not cite a specific national security threat. It cited political sensitivity. Given the potential sensitivity of named individuals in the Epstein investigative record and the current political environment. Those words are not about undercover agents or foreign intelligence intercepts. They are about optics. They are about context. They are about how information might land in a volatile political climate. Now ask yourself a simple question. Since when is political sensitivity a valid classification criterion under federal law? The classification system exists to protect national security, not reputations. It exists to shield intelligence sources and methods, not to manage fallout for senior officials. If the director's office recommended expedited review of documents referencing senior government officials because of the current political environment, then the classification process is no longer neutral. It becomes reactive. It becomes strategic. It becomes something closer to risk management for the powerful. This is where moral contrast sharpens. On one side, you have young women whose lives intersected with Jeffrey Epstein's orbit, whose testimonies were gathered, documented, sworn under oath. On the other side, you have senior officials, former presidents, principal officers of an administration. If classification decisions tilt toward protecting the latter from political exposure, what message does that send about whose vulnerability matters? Whitehouse did not say that Donald Trump committed a crime. He did not accuse Kash Patel of criminal conduct in that hearing. He did something more devastating. He laid out facts in a sequence that forced the question of motive into the open. When Patel was asked whether he was aware of the document's contents before authorizing its reclassification, he declined to answer directly. Not because he shouted, not because he invoked the Fifth Amendment, but because he shifted to deliberative process privilege, a shield meant to protect internal policy discussions. Here is the internal contradiction. If Patel did not know the contents of the document when he authorized its reclassification, then he signed off on elevating a file to special access status without understanding its substantive implications. That suggests either negligence or blind delegation. If he did know, then the decision intersects directly with knowledge that the record contained testimony naming a former president. There is no neutral middle. In prosecutorial logic, when both available explanations carry consequences, the silence itself becomes evidence of calculation. 17 seconds is not the absence of thought. It is the presence of too much thought. It is a mind running through outcomes, weighing admissions against future subpoenas, considering how a transcript will read months from now. And remember, this was not an ambush built overnight. Whitehouse requested this session 11 months ago. 11 months of subpoenas, 3 court challenges, 2 Inspector General requests. That is not the behavior of a senator fishing for a viral clip. That is the behavior of someone building a record. Building it carefully, piece by piece, until the structure can hold weight. Now step back from the partisan frame for a moment. Imagine this scenario without names attached. Imagine an FBI director who takes office and within 17 days authorizes the reclassification of documents connected to a notorious criminal investigation. Imagine that an internal memorandum from that director's office recommended expedited review of files referencing senior officials because of the political environment. Imagine that when asked whether he knew the contents of a key document before authorizing its upgrade, the director declined to answer. Would you call that routine? Or would you call that a red flag? The classification system is one of the most powerful tools in the federal government. It can protect legitimate secrets, but it can also bury inconvenient truths under layers of clearance and compartmentalization. When it is used properly, it preserves national security. When it is used strategically, it preserves power. And that is the crux of this hearing. Not whether Kash Patel is personally loyal to Donald Trump, not whether Sheldon Whitehouse is politically motivated, but whether the mechanisms designed to protect the country are being calibrated to protect specific people. Whitehouse ended this portion of questioning with clinical clarity. The American people can draw their own conclusions, he said. And that sentence is deceptively powerful because it shifts the burden from accusation to inference. The record now shows a document containing testimony that included Donald Trump's name was reclassified to top secret. Special access required 17 days into Patel's tenure. An action memorandum recommending expedited reclassification of Epstein documents referencing senior officials was issued 2 days prior. The director declined to answer whether he was aware of the document's contents before authorizing its upgrade. Chronology. And chronology, unlike rhetoric, does not depend on tone. So here is where we are after the first half of this hearing. The firewall between transparency and protection has been tested, and it flickered. The silence was not an accident. The dates were not random. The memo was not ambiguous. If classification becomes a tool to manage political risk rather than national security risk, then the entire premise of equal accountability begins to erode. And when that premise erodes, the damage does not stay inside a hearing room. It spreads into public trust, into jury pools, into every future investigation where citizens are asked to believe that the law applies evenly. This is not finished. Not even close. Here is where the room stopped being about procedure and became about conscience. Because once the paper trail was laid down and the dates were stacked in order, what remained was not a bureaucratic puzzle but a moral crossroads. And moral crossroads are uncomfortable places for people who operate best inside policy language and procedural shields. Sheldon Whitehouse did not accuse, he did not dramatize, he did not lean into partisan theatrics. He simply forced the logic to stand upright under its own weight. The silence that followed was not just about strategy, it was about consequence. And consequence is what this entire saga has been trying to outrun for years. Let us step fully into prosecutorial mode now, because the facts deserve to be handled with the same seriousness that federal courts apply when liberty is on the line. Jeffrey Epstein's investigative record is not theoretical. It is not rumor. It is not tabloid speculation. It is a documented series of witness interviews, sworn depositions, internal communications, field office reports, and memoranda that were collected over years. Among those materials sits a deposition entered into federal court record in 2020 in the Southern District of Florida, sworn under oath by a former household employee who worked inside the Palm Beach residence for 3 years. She testified that she personally observed Epstein entertaining guests on at least 40 separate occasions. On at least 12 of those occasions, she observed young women who appeared to be under the age of 18 being introduced to Epstein's associates. This is not gossip. This is sworn testimony. And when Senator Whitehouse read the line that named Donald Trump as one of the associates she recognized, he did not embellish it. He did not interpret it. He simply placed it into the congressional record in clear daylight. That matters because sunlight changes the texture of facts that were once whispered. Once it is read aloud in a federal hearing room, it stops being an online argument and becomes part of the official conversation of the United States government. And that is when the stakes change. Kash Patel did not react with visible outrage or indignation. He did not interrupt. He did not deny. He compressed. His face tightened subtly, his posture stiffened almost imperceptibly, and his eyes flicked briefly toward his attorneys before returning to neutral focus. 17 seconds passed again when he was asked whether he was aware of the document's contents before authorizing its reclassification. 17 seconds is long enough to feel the heat from the lights above the dais. 17 seconds is long enough for every reporter in the room to stop typing and simply watch. 17 seconds is long enough for a truth to either emerge or retreat. And what emerged was not clarity, but procedural shelter. Director's office memoranda are part of an internal deliberative process, Patel said quietly. That phrase, deliberative process, is a technical defense, a legal construct designed to protect internal discussions from forced disclosure. It is not an answer to whether he knew. It is not an answer to whether the decision intersected with the presence of a former president's name in the record. Notice what has happened here. The question was simple. Were you aware? The response was structural. I cannot discuss deliberative process communications. The space between those two things is where doubt grows. Now let us analyze the logic without heat, without partisanship, without emotional inflation. If Kash Patel was unaware of the deposition naming Donald Trump when he authorized the reclassification, then he made a decision to elevate a document to special access required status without reviewing or understanding its substantive implications. That suggests either a failure of due diligence or blind reliance on internal recommendation without substantive inquiry. For a director of the FBI, neither explanation inspires confidence. If, on the other hand, he was aware, then the decision cannot be divorced from knowledge that the document contained sworn testimony naming a former president in connection with a criminal investigation. That does not mean the testimony is proof of guilt. It does mean the classification decision intersects with awareness of political and reputational consequences. And when classification intersects with political consequence, motive becomes a legitimate subject of scrutiny. Whitehouse did not need to accuse Kash Patel of criminal conduct to expose that tension. He simply asked the question that reveals whether transparency bends under pressure. Because this is not about whether Donald Trump committed a crime. This is about whether the system responds differently when powerful names appear in investigative files. Now step outside the hearing room and think about the broader frame. The American public has been told repeatedly that the rule of law applies equally, that no one is above it, that investigations proceed without fear or favor. That phrase, without fear or favor, is not decorative. It is foundational. It is what separates a constitutional democracy from a system where influence rewrites outcomes. When documents in a notorious criminal investigation are reclassified upward within weeks of a new director taking office, and when internal memoranda cite political sensitivity as part of the calculus, the appearance problem alone becomes severe. And in law enforcement, appearance is not cosmetic, it is operational. If the public begins to suspect that classification tools are being used to manage optics rather than protect national security, trust erodes. Trust erodes quietly at first. It erodes when citizens read transcripts and see unanswered questions. It erodes when they watch 17 seconds of silence and feel the weight of what was not said. It erodes when process language substitutes for direct accountability. This is the moral scene that sits beneath the legal structure. On one side are individuals who testified under oath about what they witnessed inside Epstein's orbit, some of them minors at the time, some of them describing environments that exploited vulnerability. On the other side are senior officials, former presidents, administration principals, whose names carry enormous political gravity. If the system moves faster to shield the latter than to illuminate the former, what message does that send? It sends the message that access to power alters the velocity of transparency, and that message, whether intended or not, corrodes the idea that justice is blind. Whitehouse closed that portion of questioning by stating plainly that the committee would continue investigating why Epstein-related documents that were moving toward public release were suddenly buried deeper. He did not declare victory. He did not claim proof of wrongdoing. He framed the issue as protection versus accountability. Protection of whom? That is the question that lingers like a low hum beneath everything else. Because the classification system is not self-executing. It is operated by people. And when people make decisions, they bring judgment, context, priorities. The February 1st memorandum explicitly referenced the current political environment. Ask yourself this. If a document references a senior official and that reference becomes politically explosive, is the proper institutional response to elevate its classification level? Or is the proper response to ensure its accuracy and integrity while allowing lawful transparency to proceed? Classification is not supposed to be a public relations tool. It is supposed to protect national defense information, intelligence sources and methods, operational security. It is not supposed to manage embarrassment. If it becomes that, then the system ceases to function as intended. Kash Patel built much of his public identity on criticizing government cover-ups and alleging that powerful actors manipulate institutions for self-protection. He positioned himself as someone willing to challenge entrenched secrecy. Yet in this hearing, when confronted with evidence that his office moved swiftly to upgrade classification on an Epstein-related document, he declined to clarify whether he knew what that document contained. That contrast is not rhetorical, it is behavioral. And behavior under scrutiny is what defines credibility. This is not a partisan attack, it is a structural test. Does the FBI Director apply the same transparency standards when powerful names are involved as he claims to support when criticizing others? Or does institutional caution intensify when proximity to influence increases? We are not at the end of this story. We are at the point where the system has been asked a direct moral question, and the answer has not yet arrived. Because if the law applies equally, then classification decisions must withstand scrutiny even when they intersect with politically sensitive figures. If the law applies equally, then silence cannot substitute for clarity. If the law applies equally, then the phrase deliberative process cannot become a refuge from answering whether knowledge informed action. And here is the question that now hangs over everything. When the machinery of government shifts to restrict access to records connected to the powerful, is that a neutral act of caution? Or is it the quiet beginning of institutional self-preservation? That question is not rhetorical theater. It is the line between confidence and cynicism. And we are not even at the final reckoning yet. Now we arrive at the part that cannot be dismissed as partisan choreography, because what happened in that room was not about winning a news cycle, it was about whether the architecture of accountability bends when it comes into contact with gravity. And gravity, in Washington, has a name, a history, a network, and a long shadow. So let us be explicit, because ambiguity is the oxygen of evasion. This was not a normal oversight hearing about filing protocols. This was a moment where the classification system itself was put on trial. 17 days into his tenure as FBI Director, Kash Patel authorized the reclassification of a document tied to the Jeffrey Epstein investigative record. 2 days before that reclassification, an Internal Director's Office memorandum recommended expedited review of documents referencing senior government officials due to political sensitivity. When asked directly whether he knew that the record contained sworn testimony naming Donald Trump, he declined to answer. Not once, but twice, across two separate moments of silence that stretched 17 seconds each. Those are not impressions. Those are timestamps. If this were a courtroom, the jury would now be instructed to consider motive, opportunity, and action. Motive, political sensitivity surrounding senior officials in the current environment. Opportunity, new director with classification authority 17 days into office. Action, document upgraded to top secret. Special access required. No accusation has been made that Donald Trump committed a crime in that hearing room. No accusation has been formally leveled that Kash Patel committed a crime. But something more unsettling was established. When transparency collided with power, the system retreated into opacity. This is where the moral scene must be confronted directly. The Epstein case is not a partisan talking point. It is a network of allegations involving young women, some minors, who testified under oath about environments of exploitation and coercion. For years, the public has asked, who else knew? Who else attended? Who else stood in those rooms while vulnerable people were introduced into a world they did not control? The answer to that question is not entertainment. It is accountability. When a document connected to that investigative universe is elevated to special access status, the effect is not theoretical. It means fewer eyes. It means more barriers. It means additional clearance hurdles before congressional staff, inspectors general, or future prosecutors can even reference it. And when the justification language includes political sensitivity, the message shifts from national security to reputational insulation. Ask yourself plainly, if the names inside that document belonged to mid-level bureaucrats or private citizens without political gravity, would the classification have moved upward or downward? If the record contained references to individuals with no access to the levers of influence, would urgency have pointed toward sunlight instead of shadow? These are not cynical questions. They are structural ones. Because equal justice under law cannot survive selective opacity. Kash Patel built a career critiquing what he described as institutional cover-ups. He publicly framed himself as someone who challenges entrenched secrecy and exposes manipulation of government power. Yet when presented with a moment to clarify whether his own office's actions intersected with knowledge of politically explosive testimony, he chose deliberative process over directness. That is not illegal. It may even be technically defensible within the narrow lanes of executive privilege doctrine. But legality and legitimacy are not synonyms. You can comply with the letter of internal process while eroding public confidence in the spirit of accountability. And that is where this story moves beyond party lines. Because today it may involve Donald Trump's name in an investigative record. Tomorrow it could involve a Democrat, a cabinet official, a senator, anyone whose influence makes institutions hesitate. The question is not who is being shielded in this instance. The question is whether the shield exists at all. If classification tools can be activated more aggressively when politically sensitive names appear, then the incentive structure changes. Investigations become reputational risk assessments rather than truth-seeking exercises. Transparency becomes conditional. Public trust becomes fragile. When Whitehouse said the committee would continue to investigate who is being protected and why, he was not engaging in flourish. He was stating a constitutional function. Congress oversees executive agencies precisely because concentrated authority without scrutiny breeds imbalance. And imbalance in the justice system does not merely inconvenience democracy. It destabilizes it. The American public does not need spectacle. It needs coherence. It needs to know that when the FBI classifies documents, the criteria are rooted in national security, not political fallout. It needs to know that silence in a hearing room is not a substitute for transparency in governance. 17 seconds may not sound like much, but inside that chamber, it felt like an hourglass tipping. Those seconds contained calculation, risk assessment, legal counsel, institutional instinct. But they did not contain clarity. And clarity is the currency of credibility. Let us speak plainly now. If the law applies equally, then it applies equally when the file contains a former president's name. If the law applies equally, then classification decisions must withstand public explanation without collapsing into procedural fog. If the law applies equally, then no one's proximity to power should accelerate secrecy. So here is the question that will not go away. Who benefits from elevating a document tied to Jeffrey Epstein to special access status 17 days into a new director's tenure? Is it the victims seeking truth? Is it the investigators seeking clarity? Or is it the individuals whose names carry political shockwaves? And here is the deeper question that should unsettle everyone regardless of party affiliation. If classification becomes a reflexive defense mechanism for powerful figures, what happens the next time an investigation touches someone at the top? Will transparency bend again? Will silence stretch another 17 seconds? This is not about liking or disliking Donald Trump. This is not about Sheldon Whitehouse scoring points. This is about whether the mechanisms of justice are elastic when exposed to influence. Because if the answer is yes, even partially, then the rule of law is not a constant. It becomes negotiable. And if the rule of law is negotiable, then the phrase, "no one is above the law," is no longer a promise. It becomes a slogan. So I will leave you with this, and it is not rhetorical theater. When an FBI director declines to say whether he knew the contents of a politically explosive document before burying it deeper in the classification system, what does that silence protect? Is this still transparency? Is this still accountability? If the law only pierces downward and never upward, can we honestly still call it law? You have seen the dates. You have heard the deposition. You have watched the silence. Now it is your turn to decide what it means. If you believe this kind of scrutiny matters, like this video so it reaches more people who care about equal accountability. Drop your thoughts in the comments because public pressure is often the only force that keeps oversight from fading into background noise. Share this with someone who thinks classification is always neutral and ask them whether the timeline feels ordinary. And subscribe, because this story is not finished, not even close. And the next document that surfaces may answer the question that 17 seconds could not.